What has happened to the West? Why is it that Western developers can't seem to get things right anymore? And why is it that Eastern developers are seemingly immune to this? If you've been living under a rock or you're gainfully employed, then you might not have heard about the collaboration Nier Automata is doing with Stellar Blade. I mean, of course they would. Nier Automata has done a collaboration with pretty much everything under the sun at this point. And for some reason, developers are still clamoring to put 2B into the game, even though the title is almost 8 years old at this point. I guess sexy Japanese androids really do bring the world together. Now, if you didn't know, Ubisoft also did a collaboration with Nier a couple years ago, but it mostly went under the radar until the internet did their thing and dug it back up. And all I could say is the differences are quite stark, to say the least.
What the hell? Oh my god, no way.
Okay, I'm sorry, but what the hell is this, Ubisoft? Who is that? That's not an android, that's a mandroid. Ubisoft probably thought 2B stood for 2 balls. The Stellar Blade one is like the handcrafted high quality model, and the Ubisoft one is like the one you get from AliExpress. I'm actually bewildered here because this collaboration was supposed to be a home run for Ubisoft because everyone likes 2B. She's one of the most iconic characters in all of video game history, and a major reason for that is because she's hot. Like, you have one job, Ubisoft, to make her attractive. That's it. Or at least make her look like a female. And I know this is just a skin for one of their operators in Rainbow Six Siege, but even then, this character still looks like a woman. I don't know why it's so hard for them to do anything right. It's like they're allergic to success. And the sad thing is that Ubisoft isn't the only publisher slash studio like this. They're one of the many that has fallen into the modern audience trap, which is really depressing. In order to really paint a better picture on how widespread this issue is, let's take a look at some of the biggest notable flops of 2024, shall we? Skull and Bones, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, Star Wars Outlaws, Dustborn, Unknown 9 Awakening, Dragon Age the Veilguard. You guys notice the pattern here? Notice anything similar between all these titles? Yeah, they're all made by Western studios. Now how about we take a look at some of the most notable successes of 2024? Metaphor ReFantazio, Black Myth Wukong, Power World, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Persona 3 Reload, Warhammer 40k, Helldivers 2, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, and Astrobot. I mean, just from a cursory glance, the amount of great Eastern games vastly outnumber the amount of great Western games, and it's been like that for quite some time now. So why is it that Western game studios are having so much trouble making good games nowadays, and why aren't the Eastern devs affected by the Kool-Aid that the Westerners are drinking? Well, the problem is that the amount of forgettable and mediocre games that the West produces far outnumbers the amount of gems, especially coming from the AAA studios. You know, the ones that are supposed to be making high quality products. But lately, Western AAA studios have pretty much stopped focusing on providing the best possible game that they can make, and instead resorted to pushing out the same generic formulaic slop year after year. Well, why is that, you may ask? It's simple. Many of these studios have gotten complacent. Video games used to be a medium where passionate developers always tried to innovate and experiment in order to find what sticks. That's why during the early 2000s era, we saw a plethora of experimental games, which some worked and several more didn't. But the underlying goal was always the same, to try something new and see if it works. And this mindset led to the creation of many of the most iconic franchises in the world, which catapulted the respective studios to the legendary status that they are today. And naturally, these devs would try to keep that same formula in order to capitalize on the popularity. After all, why fix something that isn't broken? But unfortunately, somewhere down the line, these studios realized that they no longer had to innovate or experiment with what they had, and they could just basically re-release the same thing and still make money. For example, in 2012, Ubisoft had just launched Far Cry 3 into the world to a record-smashing success. This title was universally praised by everyone because at the time it was something new, something novel, and everyone loved it. So in an attempt to cash in on this newfound success, they would release Far Cry 4 using a very similar formula. And despite being nearly identical in gameplay, it was still received fairly well. But unfortunately, rehashing the same thing over and over again can only get you so far until it starts to get stale. Meaning that the subsequent releases of Far Cry games got less and less fanfare because people have just started to get tired of it. Ubisoft failed to innovate on the series for over 10 years now because they thought they could just give the people the same game with a different coat of paint to the point where the audience finally had enough. This is not a unique story. In fact, many of our favorite video game franchises today are following the exact same pipeline. The sad part is that this is mostly a Western game dev problem, where instead of trying to add something new to the industry, they're pretty much only following trends that other developers before had done better. That's why we got Concord, one of the most generic, by-the-numbers hero shooter slop that we've ever seen before in an already oversaturated market. This game brought absolutely nothing new to the table, and in fact probably took more away from it because one of the biggest strengths of a hero shooter are the heroes. I mean, that should be obvious, right? Well, apparently not to the devs and corporate suits at Firewalk Studios because they believed that they could get away with putting out the worst character designs and the most mediocre gameplay known to man. Well, that didn't work out, now did it? They legitimately believed in their own delusion that if they just put out the same crap that's been done a million times already, but instead pumped a lot more money into it, then people will have no choice but to love the game. They don't realize that good graphics and high production quality no longer entices people because that's the norm now. Gamers nowadays are looking for a more unique experience that has more quality even at the expense of production value, rather than a huge expansive game that's filled with vast amounts of mediocre experiences. And unfortunately, that's what most Western AAA game corporations fail to see, and that's why they keep pushing out the same slop every year. And not only is it slop, but it's also incredibly expensive slop as well. The gaming industry in the West is currently going through something I'd like to call Hollywoodization, where publishers and studios have these huge delusions of grandeur that they could become the next mainstream cultural phenomenon. And because of that, they'll literally throw hundreds of millions of dollars at the production of some of these titles that were artificially manufactured by a committee of corporate suits who've never even touched a video game in their lives. They'll then hire all these A-list celebrities slash voice actors, they'll have the best graphical fidelity that money can buy, and they'll outsource all of their work to a bajillion different studios so they can deliver within their tight schedule. The business of making video games has become so expensive nowadays that these studios have to literally sell tens of millions of copies just to break even. It's an unsustainable business model at this point, and is a major factor in the mass layoffs that have been occurring within the gaming industry these past few years. That's why games like Skull and Bones, which is reportedly to have had a budget between $600 and $800 million, failed so spectacularly. That's why Concord, which allegedly had a budget of at least $400 million, became one of the biggest disasters in video game history. And the worst part about all this spending is that despite the ludicrous budgets, most of the time these games still launch broken and unfinished. Western game publishers don't understand that simply throwing more money at the production won't make games good anymore. And for some reason, the Eastern devs have already figured this out a long time ago. You wanna know what the budget for Elden Ring was? $200 million. You wanna know what the budget for Black Myth Wukong was? $70 million. Final Fantasy XVI? $59 million. Resident Evil 4 Remake? $100 million. Need I go on? Why is it that Eastern studios spend only a fraction of what Western ones do and still end up making absolute fire every time? Now obviously there are some exceptions, Forspoken, but for the most part, it seems like Asian game devs don't really suffer from this same Hollywoodification. They just make the game without spending any more than what's necessary and be done with it. And that's why they're also not going through a huge layoff crisis like we are in the West. Maybe we should learn a thing or two about being frugal, cause Lord knows we need it. The other reason why Western game studios are lagging so far behind the Eastern counterparts is because of the massive increase in political activism within the West. During the last couple of years, there's been a huge cultural shift in progressivism within our society to the point where even the media that we consume has started to reflect the real-life worldviews of the creators. Video games used to be just about escaping to a fantasy world where you can roleplay as characters who can perform superhuman feats. Characters who are at their peak in physical condition, and characters who have an interesting story to tell. Video games were always about being someone you're not in a world that doesn't exist, with scenarios that never happened in real life. They were the perfect place to escape to because you were always the main character in a world completely divorced from ours. Both Eastern and Western developers understood this well back in the day when the gaming industry wasn't as big as it is now. But for some reason within recent years, there's been a massive paradigm shift within the political climate in the West to the point where we pretty much see politics play a big role in everything we consume nowadays. It's in our television, it's in our movies, and now it's in our video games. This cultural shift has made it so that all of our media has to be sanitized and politically correct now because there could be an off chance that one person might get offended. So because of that mindset, every AAA game nowadays has to either be the same inoffensive mediocre slop or have some sort of soapbox message that they have to incorporate. Seriously, why is it that Western developers can't just make a game that looks cool or feels badass anymore? Like, just put the assets in the engine, bro. We don't want to hear what you think about capitalism. And because of this activism, they always have to tone their games down by either making all the characters butt ugly or the story incredibly bland with ham-fisted social messaging. Like how Firewalk Studios intentionally made every character in their roster look like the Temu version of Guardians of the Galaxy because they wanted to avoid the male gaze. But the designs were so bad that not even the male gaze wanted to play this game. Or how in Dragon Age the Veilguard we need to have characters who self-flagellate whenever they commit the heinous crime of accidentally misgendering someone. My question is, why? Why can't devs just make a fun game anymore? Why does it always have to spread some sort of fringe ideological message or reflect our real world cultural climate? Why can't we just kill dragons while looking badass? These developers nowadays have become so entrenched in their own politics that it's become their entire personality, and anyone who disagrees with them is wrong or evil, even if it's their own player base. They can't fathom making a product that normal people would enjoy, and this lack of understanding and patronization of their own audience has finally caused gamers to push back against stuff like this because it's become so exhausting at this point. Now we have developers who actively hate the people that play their games because they're revolting against the social messaging that's forcefully injected into their games. Calling people talentless freaks or telling them not to buy it if they don't like it on social media. Well, advice taken, and now you've lost your job. Meanwhile, the Eastern development studios are growing and consistently putting out more and more bangers every single year. 5 of the 6 Game of the Year nominees for this year are from Eastern devs, and the one Western game is from an indie studio. And you want to know why these Asians across the ocean are significantly surpassing us in terms of quality? It's because they focus on 2 of the most important things that players want. Cool looking characters and engaging gameplay. That's it. They're not trying to check off some diversity quota or spread some soapbox message about how misgendering people is wrong. All they want to do is make good games that they think fans would enjoy. And in doing so, they naturally create diversity that doesn't feel forced. For example, Metaphor ReFantasio has an incredibly diverse cast of characters that also look visually appealing. Take note of this, Western devs. You can have diversity and representation while being attractive. They're not mutually exclusive. And the funniest part is that this was made by a Japanese studio in Japan, one of the most homogenous countries in the world. How is it that a Japanese studio can make better looking characters while also being way more diverse than 90% of Western games? It's because they just want to make a good game that fans want without having to virtue signal every step of the way. And that's why Eastern developers have far surpassed Western ones, and it's not even close anymore.